Hello everyone. Today we are going to see about friction. This is Unit 5 of Grade 10 syllabus. What is friction? Think that you push or pull an object on a surface. The frictional force will form between those two surfaces. Friction is a force between two surfaces that are sliding or trying to slide across each other. What about the direction of friction? Yes, this frictional force always acts on the opposite direction to the given force or opposite to the direction of movement. For example, when you try to push a wardrobe along the floor, friction makes this difficult. So, here the surface is floor and friction acts between wardrobe and floor. In this picture, you can see this person is trying to push this object. When he pushes this object in this direction, the friction is given in the opposite direction for the applied force. As this frictional force opposes the motion of an object, friction always slows a moving object down. Okay, think that you are pushing a book or pushing a cupboard or pushing any other object. Do you think that the frictional force act on those three situations are same? Not exactly same, because the amount of friction depends on the materials from which the two surfaces are made. The rougher the surface, the more friction is produced. So, surface of a book, cupboard and all are different one another. So that is clear. The friction is depend on the surface of this object and the flow. And there are several different surfaces are there. This is a rough surface and there are some smooth surface also you can see and friction is very high in rough surfaces than smooth surface. Friction produces heat. To check this, rub your hands together and quickly feel the heat on your hand. What is the reason for this heat? When a friction acts between two surfaces for a long period, it produces the heat. So, you will find the friction everywhere that the objects comes into contact with another object. The force acts in the opposite direction to the way an object wants to slide. If a car needs to stop at a stop sign, it slows because of the friction between brakes and the wheels. Friction is a force that holds back the movement of a sliding object. In this picture, you can see the movement of a car, and here this is the way where this car goes, and the friction occurs between the brakes and wheel. Also, when this tire rotate in one direction, the frictional force act on opposite direction. Same like in this tire, frictional force act on opposite direction to the applied force. Also, scientists have discovered that there is even less friction in your joints than in Teflon. Friction is a force between two surfaces that are sliding or trying to slide across each other. For example, when you try to push a book along the floor, friction makes this difficult. Friction always works in the direction opposite to the direction in which the object is moving or trying to move. Friction always slows a moving object down. The amount of friction depends on the material from which the two surfaces are made. The rougher the surface, the more friction is produced. Friction also produces heat. If you rub your hands together quickly, you will feel them get warmer. Friction can be a useful force because it prevents our shoes slipping on the pavement when we walk and stop car tires skidding on road. When you walk, friction is caused between the tread on shoes and the ground. The friction acts to grip the ground and prevent sliding. Sometimes we want to reduce friction. For example, we use oil to reduce the friction between the moving parts inside a car engine. The oil holds the surface apart and can flow between them. To reduce the friction means there is less wear on a car's moving part and less heat produced. Finally, this is the definition for the frictional force. The forces that act between the surfaces of two objects in contact with each other to oppose the relative motion when the objects are moving relative to each other, or to oppose the tendency to move when the objects have a tendency to move relative to each other, are called frictional force. Okay, finally, frictional force always opposite to the applied force, that is clear, and frictional force always restrict the movement of an object. In this picture, you can see this object is given on this object's weight is given on this surface. According to the Newton's third law, this weight has equal and opposite reaction R. Equal, this is the way of weight. According to the Newton's third law, it has equal and opposite direction in this way. Okay. When the force is given to this object, friction acts on opposite direction between these two surfaces. Okay, this is the applied force. So this object will tend to move in this direction. But this frictional force will tend to opposes the direction, the movement of this object. So frictional force will act on opposite direction between the surfaces of this object and this floor. Okay, so when you take an object, you should identify or mark the forces which act on this object. At first, weight is given to the flow by this object, and opposite and equal and opposite force are, and the direction of applied force and the direction of frictional force. Types of frictional forces. We can divide frictional force into three major categories depending on the situation they act on a body. So according to this, we divide as static frictional force, limiting frictional force, and dynamic frictional force. This division is according to the situations. Okay. Static frictional force. What is that? Force that act when there is no relative motion, even though a force applied on the body. Okay, what do you understand by this sentence? Static force act on an object when they are resting on a surface. When they are resting on a surface. For example, if you are hiking in a wood, there is a static friction between your shoes and the trail each time you put down your foot. Without this static friction, your feet would slip out from under you, making it difficult to walk. In fact, that's exactly what happens if you try to walk on ice. That's because ice is very slippery and offers very little friction. Okay, second, limiting frictional force. What is that? Force that act on a body as it just begins to move. This force includes small additional force that is necessary to give it a velocity. Okay, what do you understand by limiting frictional force? For example, if you apply a force of 1 Newton onto one side of a large concrete cube kept on rod, the cube will not move due to the friction between the surface of it and the rod. Now apply 5 Newton of force. Still, the cube would not. You keep on increasing the load. Even when you have reached 20 Newtons, the cube wouldn't move. Suppose if the applying force reaches 21 Newton of force, it moves. That means the force of 20 Newton is the limiting friction. Also, this limiting frictional force is lower than static frictional force because static frictional force is a very big resistance for the movement of that object. But limiting frictional force acts just before the object starts that movement. Okay? That's why it's easier to slide a piece of something, some objects over the floor after you start it moving than it is to get it moving in the first place. Okay? Okay. Third, dynamic frictional force. What is that? Force that act on bodies when they are in relative motion. Okay, after the limiting frictional force, when this object started to move, it continues the motion. During this movement, the frictional force which acts on that body is dynamic frictional force. This dynamic frictional force is always lower than static frictional force and limiting frictional force. That's why the object is moving. So, I hope you are clear with the types of frictional force: static frictional force, limiting frictional force, and dynamic frictional force. Here in this picture, you can see three types of friction. Static friction, when this object has no motion, and sliding friction. Sliding friction means when this object is sliding, that means just moving on a flow. Okay, the thing that you are pushing this object. And next, rolling friction. Rolling friction means when this object is rolling on the floor. So they have categorized this type of friction according to the motion. That means whether it is sliding motion or rolling motion. Anyhow, the previous types of friction is very important than this one. Okay. Okay, now let's see what are the factors affecting the limiting frictional force. Limiting frictional force depend on the nature of the contact surface. Likewise, this does not depend on the surface area of that object. And limiting frictional force increases when the normal reaction between the two forces increase. Okay, this is the experiment to prove that the limiting frictional force is depend on the surface in contact. Okay, what are the steps? You can see this is the object, block of wood, and this is Newton balance connected to this object. They are fixing a sandpaper at the undersurface of this object. When they fix this sandpaper, the rough surface of the sandpaper should meet the flow, and the smooth surface of the sandpaper will cover the underside of this object. Okay. Use several sandpapers of increasing roughness. Take one sandpaper and fix the block of wood with the sandpaper having lowest roughness with rough side facing out and completely covering the bottom surface. That means the rough surface touch the table of object and reverse side touch the bottom of that object. Newton balance attached to the block, and pull the Newton balance with very small horizontal force at first and then increasing the force gradually. Repeat the above procedure using several sandpapers of increasing roughness and record the limiting frictional force each time. Okay, by using the Newton balance, you are trying to pull this object and you are starting from very small force, and when you increase the force, at one point this object will tend to move. That is the force Mark it on Newton balance, that is the frictional force of this object. That means frictional force between these two surfaces. Okay, by repeating this experiment with several sandpapers of different roughness, finally you can detect that limiting frictional force is changing according to the roughness between these two surfaces. Okay, so observation: limiting frictional force increases gradually with increasing roughness of the sandpapers used to cover the block of object or wood. So what is your conclusion? So the conclusion is limiting frictional force depend on the nature of the surface in contact. Okay, this is second experiment. Limiting frictional force does not depend on the surface area. So by doing this practical, we can finally take a conclusion about the influence of surface area in the limiting frictional force. Okay, here they are taking only one object and there are three surfaces. Okay, at first they are using surface area A, and second they are using surface area B, and third they are using surface area C. Okay, so by using the Newton balance like the previous practical, they are starting from the small force and gradually increasing the force by Newton balance. At one point, this object will tend to move even through the three surfaces. But the observation is limiting frictional force marked by these Newton balance are same for all three surfaces A, B and C. Okay, so we can tell that limiting frictional force does not depend on the surface area. Okay, in this practical, we are trying to find out the influence of another force in the limiting frictional force. Okay, limiting frictional force increases when the normal reaction between the two forces increases. Okay, let's check that. Here there are three experiments. At first step there is only one box, and at the second step there are two boxes, and at the third step there are three boxes. Okay, and we are placing all these boxes and trying to move this object by Newton balance. Okay, and find the force required to just move this lock. Finally, you can see that the required force to move this object is different in each step. That means when the weight is increased, required force is also increasing. You can note that in the Newton balance. Okay, now take this object. Here, this one object will give this weight force onto the flow. Likewise, the equal and opposite perpendicular reaction force is acting on opposite direction. So, we are trying to find out the connection between this perpendicular opposite force and this required force. So when this perpendicular reaction force will increase with this weight. When the weight increase, this perpendicular reaction force also increase. So this perpendicular reaction force is higher in this setup, third setup, because there are three objects are there. So when this perpendicular reaction force is increasing, the applied force, the required force is also increasing. So finally we can say limiting frictional force increases when the normal reaction between the two forces increase. Okay, now let's see advantage and disadvantages of frictional force. Okay, what are the disadvantages of frictional force? At first, it produces unnecessary heat, leading to the wastage of energy. And forest fires are caused due to the friction between tree branches. And car engines become hotter because of friction. Sometimes noise is also produced in machineries. Engines of automobile consume more fuel, which is a money loss. So you can there are several disadvantages in frictional forces. Likewise, friction also plays a vital role in our daily life. Without friction, we are handicapped. Why is that? What is the reason? Yes, it's become difficult to walk on a slippery road due to the low friction. Okay? Why? We feel difficult to walk on ice because it has low friction. It is difficult to walk on ice than what? Than walking on a surface, because the ice have very low static friction. So we can't even stand on the ice, that is very slippery. Okay, that is very difficult to walk on the ice. Okay, a horse cannot pull a cart unless friction furnishes him a scarce footland. So when you walk, friction is formed between the tread on shoes and the ground. This friction acts to grip the ground and prevent sliding. Okay. Now let's read this slide. It allows us to walk on earth's surface and to write with a pen on a surface of a paper, even to write properly, and to stand your hand, keep your hand on properly on a paper. This frictional force is very important. Okay, it allows us to fix a nail in the wall. Um, moving object would never be able to come to the state of rest without the frictional force. It would not be possible to drive any automobiles on the road without the frictional force. Yes, that is true. It would not be possible to construct any buildings without the frictional force. Okay, that is true. Also, have you seen the disc brake system of a car? Yes, I have provided the picture in the next slide. You can see in a modern motor vehicle, disc brakes are used to stop the vehicle, such as brake system is given in the next slide. And in this system, frictional force caused by pressing the brake pads against a disc attached to a attached to the wheel are used to stop the wheels from rotating. Also, in the coil ropes, have you seen coil ropes? Okay, this rope is made by twisting a large number of coil fibers together. Even when a large force is applied on a rope, the fibers do not separate because of the friction among them. It is easier to unite a knot made with a nylon string than a knot made with a coil string. This is because the frictional forces among the coil fibers are stronger than those among the nylon fibers. Okay. Here you can read the disadvantage of frictional force. Frictional force results in wear and tear of objects such as the moving part of a machine and tires of a vehicle, sole of the shoes, etc. It is also result in the production of heat in the machines, and this is lead to wastage of energy. The frictional force also lead to a decrease in the speed of a moving object or sometimes stop it. It can lead to noise pollution in certain cases. For instance, aircraft produce loud sounds due to the resistance of the air. Okay. In this picture, you can see one advantage of frictional force. This is the normal flow. Here we can stand, walk easily, but in the ice, the static frictional force and limiting frictional force, all the frictional forces are very low, so that is easier to slipper. This is easier to slipper here. So the frictional force is very low in the ice. So this is an advantage of frictional force to walk very easily on the flow. Likewise, you can see some advantageable picture of the friction here. Okay, this is the car engine system. Okay. Already explained the action of friction here. Okay, this is one of the disadvantage of friction. They cause unnecessary noises and more force required to dry, and cause noise pollution and fire in forest. Okay, methods to reducing of friction. Okay. As we saw earlier, in some cases, friction is absolutely necessary, but it has both positive and negative effects. So, anyhow, in some cases, we have to minimize this friction. Okay, so tell me, what are the methods used to reduce the friction in our daily life? Friction is in contact with two surfaces. So here we have to alter the surface of touching. So by altering this surface, we can change the friction. Okay, friction can be reduced by making the surface smooth by polishing. Polishing is one of the method to reduce friction. Okay, next, lubricants. Applying lubricants like oils or grease to the rubbing surface. Friction can be reduced by using wheel to move object. Okay, friction can be reduced by ball bearing between the moving parts of machines. Ball bearing structures will let them to roll easily, so that will help to reduce the friction. Okay. You can see talcum powder in this carom board. When you apply some talcum powder, this carom board disc will move easily. This talcum powder is reducing the friction between this carom board and the surface of disc. Likewise, this is the application of lubricants, that means grease or oils. When you apply that, they will smooth the surface and they will reduce the noises between the machinery structures. Also, this is ball bearing structures of wheel. So think these two objects are rotating. So these ball bearing structures will reduce the friction between these two circles. Okay, today we studied about friction, where this friction act, what is friction and what is the direction of friction, types of friction, advantage and disadvantage of friction, and in some cases we need friction and in some cases it has disadvantages. So here we have to reduce the friction. What are the methods to reduce the friction? So students, I will meet you in next new lesson of structure and function of the plant and animal cells in next video.